Welcome back to Neon Galactic, a podcast produced by PBS affiliate Key TV in Northern California. I'm your host and fellow traveler, James Falk. Thanks for joining us. First, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel or follow this podcast so that we can continue our adventures in re-enchantment. Second, I'm asking folks to please fill out the survey. I've linked in the description. We're in the process of building a community here, and if you can take the time to help us figure out what folks need to better foster a deep and potentially transformative resource, it could make all the difference. We want to center the subjectivity of anomalous phenomena and create a space that fosters the kind of broad hermeneutical dialogue that people need to process and, if they want, share their experiences. We'll have more to announce soon on that front, so please stay tuned. Our species recently decided that it has figured out most, if not all, of the complexities that underlie reality. We've concluded that there's nothing substantive left to learn, mistaking our mental models and a sense-making instinct for absolute truth. This severs us from wonder. In that severance, we've lost potent powers and connectivity, and feel like we've been cut adrift in a meaningless universe where only matter matters. Humility, though, can wake us up again to magic. Our guest today, author Eric Wargo, has written 2 books now in support of his idea that the human mind is capable of recollecting both past and future events. The first, Time Loops, is a kind of primer on the subject, offering important examples of this precognitive retro-causal connection between the present moment and meaningful instances in the future. From Nowhere, his second book, continues to develop those points by focusing on the creative work of several well-known artists and writers who seem to have access to strangely prescient information about pivotal moments in their own future lives, data that emerges in their art. By charting those moments and connections, Wargo makes a strong argument for the reality of precognition, then explains how current science can accommodate that reality. His approach can help explain much of what we've generically gathered together and call the paranormal. His views challenge reflexive skeptics who dismiss such events as fantasy, and yet can also confront those among us who have declared materialism dead. Consciousness isn't the fundamental prima materia in Wargo's model. The brain remains a physical system, but one with reach and capabilities that we've only now begun to understand. In journalism, I learned a long time ago that the best news stories are those that rattled both sides of an issue, charting a course of hard truth over dogma. Eric Wargo is breaking that kind of trail. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you, James. I'm excited to be here.
So, I was, I was initially disappointed by aspects of your book for that very reason that we discussed, where consciousness isn't the primary substance that it seems a lot of people are thinking it is these days. But it is so elegantly fitted to what a lot of the phenomenologies of the paranormal, and you explain those in your books, that it's hard to dismiss as something that could potentially really be the explanation for a broad swath of that kind of stuff. But let's start with how you came to the theory. I mean, what led you to sort of pick up on the fact that maybe we're all just sort of sensing big moments in our future rather than connecting on some, unified field theory or something?
Yeah. So my backstory with this is I'll give you the short version. I've given the long version on other podcasts, but the short version is, I was brought up scientifically trained person in a scientific household. My parents were scientific psychologists, and of all people, of all humans on the planet, scientific psychologists are the most hostile to ESP, anything related to psychic phenomena. Uh, but I so in 2009, I had a minor UFO sighting, which it wasn't up close and personal, but it got me to go down the rabbit hole that we all go down when we have one of these encounters or experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah,
And
yeah. And we've talked about that a lot. That's the basis
yes,
of the show.
right.
Yeah.
So for me, yeah, it wasn't the encounter itself that was so transformative, but it was the reading I was doing in the aftermath that was transformative, really. And as one does, one encounters the work of Jacques Vallée, and and here was a very smart, brilliant, I would say, thinker from a scientific background who was talking about not only the UFO reality, but also talking about its connections to psychic phenomena and the reality of psychic phenomena. And, I was totally open to UFOs, and I'd always sort of been open to that. And it was just exciting that to find out that there were actual smart people writing about this subject. But wow, it was a real shakeup, I guess, of my worldview to have smart people talking about ESP and psychic experiences and taking that seriously, because that was not part of my worldview up until that point. So that was a bit of cognitive dissonance. And then shortly thereafter, I happened to be working as an editorial director for a psychology organization. And shortly thereafter, a landmark study in precognition crossed my desk from another psychology organization. And the editors of my higher ups in that organization were thinking of writing a letter to the other organization saying they should, this is preposterous. It should never be published, and so on. So
Can
there
I
I
ask if
saw,
was that Daryl Bem's work? Any
yeah,
of
that was
that?
Daryl Bem's Feeling the
Yeah,
Future article
yeah,
in
yeah,
2011.
yeah.
Uh,
Okay,
very, important, fascinating
yeah.
study. And boy, so I was reading this like incredible, research that didn't make sense, but was fascinating. And then I was seeing suddenly this really defensive, almost bullying reaction from people in the field of scientific psychology. And those two things, I guess, combined, like I realized, okay, there's something here. My sort of part of my intellectual background is psychoanalytic theory. Okay,
Mhm.
Freud and Lacan and stuff like that,
Yeah.
Jung. And when you see, when you see someone protesting too much, you know, is that okay? There's something here, that's striking a chord, and the denials and the hostility that was sort of that had no substance to it.
Yeah, yeah,
This
yeah.
can't be real, and thus it's wrong, and people got very upset. When people get very upset and there's no real reason that's visible for it, you know that there's something interesting going on under the surface. And so
Absolutely.
anyway, those I think two things kind of set me on the path to really studying psychic phenomena. The UFO topic, I kind of lost interest in actually pretty quickly, because I saw that the field was so full of charlatans and credulous people, and so much disinformation and manipulation, and it's just like it was a quagmire, and I kind of set it aside for many years actually until recently. But the I did my due diligence reading about ESP research, and precognition especially interested me. And I discovered that, oh, wait, I've had these experiences. And since I lacked a framework for understanding them, I just ignored them. But so that added then, I have a personal
Yeah,
connection to the topic. I realized, oh, yeah, this is something that I've experienced in my life. And the more I paid attention to it, the more I noticed it. And I
yeah.
realized, oh, there's something that's going on under the surface that we don't talk about, and mostly we don't notice, but this is universal. This is a part of the human condition. And there's abundant science. Don't listen to people who tell you there's no scientific
Yeah,
basis.
and they
I mean, there's
that's exactly what
abundant.
they say. Yeah, I mean, that's so bizarre, but yeah, they excuse it. I had Dean Radin on the show, and it was like we were talking about some of the evidence, and it's just like there's so much, and it's a small effect, but it's broad, and people just want to close their eyes to it. I
And I
guess
would
it's that
dispute,
emotional reaction, you know?
well, I would dispute that it's a small effect. And this is why in the end, I don't write about this topic from the standpoint of a scientist. Okay.
Okay.
I'm really trying to approach it from an interdisciplinary standpoint.
Mhm.
The scientific evidence, the experimental evidence can tell you something, but it can only tell you what a study is designed to look for. Okay.
Yeah,
And there are all kinds of reasons. This is something that if you've had Jeff Kripal on your show, he's probably talked about this. I mean, these are the kinds of things that don't don't emerge very readily in cold,
Yeah.
experimental kinds of settings. And there are a number of subjects that aren't very amenable to scientific study in psychological settings, dreams being another one. I mean, forgetting the topic of precognitive dreams, which is a big topic in my work,
Yeah.
just dreams in general, it's very hard to study them. And that difficulty of studying them has led to a disinterest in things like dreams in among psychologists, scientific psychologists. But then it's also constrained the kinds of explanations that are offered for why we dream. And it's a perennial subject, in the science literature. Oh, every 6 months there'll be a new study. Oh, here's a new theory of why we dream. And it's never convincing. And it's always based on some little study that is looked at it from some little point of view
Yeah.
that they were able to do in a lab. But, things that have a dimension of meaning, you know,
Yeah.
are they're intrinsically hard to replicate and falsify, in an experimental context. So anyway, the yes, you'll have skeptics and debunkers say, "Oh, there's no evidence," but there's tons of experimental evidence that, yes, generally shows a small effect, but I think it's actually a huge effect, and
Sure.
we're not able to show that scientifically with a p-value
Yeah.
yet, but it's pervasive in human life. Uh, I mentioned dreams. The people have precognitive dreams all the time, and when they're awakened to the possibility of precognition and given a sort of rudimentary theory of how it might work, they start noticing it all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think it's often written about as something, well, occasionally you might have a dream that's precognitive. Or if you have such a dream, you may be a precog, and I'm guilty of using that language sometimes too, because it helps kind of hook readers.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I
Yeah, yeah.
think this is part of, I think it's intrinsic to how the brain works. We can talk about the brain, versus
Yeah.
other less material ways of talking about it.
Yeah.
But it's basic. It's a basic part of human experience, and I think I can envision a future psychology decades down the road that in which it's actually central
Yeah.
in how we engage with the world. But it's going to require a huge paradigm shift
Yeah.
to be able to talk about that and get it recognized and then studied appropriately and so on.
That's such a problem on so many fronts. Like the recognizing, and that's why I mentioned humility in my intro. It's something I've been hammering on lately. It's like, it's not like we need all these paradigm shifts, but it's almost as if we just need to surrender the idea of a paradigm. It's like we have, I mean, and that's never going to happen, but we have these notions that like what we've built up in terms of our knowledge is this sacred monument to our progress, but it locks us into boxes that we can't. Therefore, we won't consider things that occur outside of it because to do so would question, previous work in our careers or the careers of people that we respect and follow. And it's unfortunate because there are things that are just now coming up that are revolutionary and could potentially explain many of the mysteries that we've held for, thousands of years, but we've just got to open our minds to it. And people like you, luckily, are making those arguments. Can you talk a little bit about your own journey in terms of because you've did some like recording of your dreams and found that there was like precognitive patterns that appeared, right? So, I mean, it's interesting to me that when people start doing that, first of all, they seem to dream more often, or at least they remember their dreams more, and they'll just kind of make that part of their life more vibrant. Did you have that experience? And can you give our listeners an example of some things that you noticed that you were precogging from your dream state?
Sure. Yeah. So anyone who does any kind of dream work, uh, which always involves writing down your dreams. I mean, you can't do any kind of dream work without writing them down because they're very fleeting in terms of being able to remember them.
Yeah.
But anyone who does any kind of dream work, which means keeping a dream journal,
Mm.
immediately finds that they start to dream very richly and vividly, where if they hadn't before. There's something about just having a notebook and pen by the side of your bed that kind of primes your, it's not that you weren't dreaming before, but you weren't paying attention. You weren't remembering it. And you weren't
Yeah.
in that sort of hypnopompic state as you're awakening. You weren't kind of going, wait a minute, what was I just
Yeah.
dreaming? Because you kind of have to do that thing to then kind of
Hmm.
remember the dream enough to write it down. Otherwise it's just going to be, it's going to evaporate.
Yeah.
Um,
I love
but
that though. That's just amazing that the more you pay attention, the more it kind of blossoms, you know? I mean,
Yeah,
anyway.
so I had been interested in dreams since I was a kid, not
Hmm.
thinking at all about precognition. That wasn't even a concept for me. And then in graduate school in the early 90s, one of my advisors was a psychoanalyst. And I was really kind of steeped at that point in Freudian writing, Freudian theory, Lacan, and so on. And so I just sort of naturally started paying attention to my dreams, and then in the mid 90s I started keeping a dream journal electronically on a laptop. And so I'd sort of been doing that practice very intensively, or faithfully, I'll say, for a decade and a half before the concept of precognition even crossed my mind as
Yeah.
something real. And that was an advantage because I was able not only to see that my dreams going forward were, oh, there were sometimes precognitive, but I was able to go back and look at past dreams
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
oh, this was, oh my God, it never occurred to me. It doesn't occur to people. It simply doesn't occur to people, even if they are dream workers, even if they keep a dream journal and, process them in some Jungian way or Freudian, whatever. It doesn't occur to people to go back to their dreams and compare those dreams to later events in their life,
Yeah.
either
Yeah. Yeah.
unfolding over the next few days after the dream or on anniversaries of the dream. Very often, dreams target significant experiences exactly a year or exactly multiple years in the future.
How does that
Um,
happen? I mean,
yeah,
how do
it's what
we, yeah, sorry.
Okay, well, I have some ideas about it, and this is something that
Okay.
I've noticed in my journaling, but also that I've talked to a number of other dream workers, what I call precognitive dream workers, who've noticed the same phenomenon, and they can find myriad examples of this in their dream journals,
Yeah.
where somehow the brain keeps track of dates, unconsciously, usually, but it's no different from the way, oh, you feel, oh gosh, I'm sad today. I'm like, well, that's weird. Why am I feeling so sad? And then you look at the calendar and realize, oh, this is the day my my grandfather passed away, 10 years ago. And like I've always felt sad on this day. It's like, so there's an unconscious priming
Yeah.
effect of the date. Well, precognition, I argue, and many people argue, is just memory for things future. It's our memory goes both directions in time.
Yeah.
Uh, so we are pre-minded on a certain date
Mhm.
of an emotional upheaval that's going to happen in our life a year ahead or multiple years ahead, that's sort of primed by that date. That's just one of the
Yeah.
kinds of factors that can determine having a precognitive dream at a certain time about a certain topic in our lives.
Yeah.
Uh, I have a name for it. It's calendrical resonance. Actually, I have
Okay.
three. The second book I wrote was called Precognitive Dreamwork and the Long Self. And it was a guide to working with precognitive dreams, and it sort of outlines this whole hypothesis and
Okay.
a number of other principles for working with these kinds of dreams.
Yeah.
Um, but anyway, yeah, so I was noticing I was having these experiences and started working with them. Uh, I can't say scientifically because I wasn't, comparing them to other people's dreams, and you can't do science on yourself.
Yeah.
Dreams are always going to be anecdotes, no matter
Yeah.
how,
It's always subjective, right? I mean,
subjective. Yeah, and there's a
yeah.
subjective component. So it's like it's very hard to convince a skeptic that uh, that your dream record, really matches some event, because usually, uh, first of all, your dreams represent events in a very idiosyncratic, symbolic, associative way. Usually, they're not usually video quality.
Mhm.
Uh, and, so how are you going to establish that it relates to a future event? Even if you have recorded the dream faithfully before the event happens, there's no way to rule out that you didn't falsify that report. There's no way to rule out, there's no way to prove that these particular dream associations or symbols are really relevant to that event. And even if it's, uh, sort of a video quality thing, they'll just say, well, it's coincidence.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
law of large numbers because in a world of random chance, coincidences are going to occur
Yeah.
periodically.
Everyone has hugely unlikely events happen in their lives, several times. And so,
Yeah, several
yeah.
times. But the thing is, when you start doing precognitive dream work, you find it's happening all the time. And I always say, with the law of large numbers, the large numbers are supposed to be in the denominator. But when they're in the numerator, that argument goes out the door. And it
Yeah,
really does
absolutely.
when you do this work.
Yeah.
But yeah, but dreams aren't the only, that's
Manifestation.
one venue for approaching this subject. And the new book is about art and creativity because I think it's just as prevalent.
Yeah,
And
and it's fascinating the way you break it down, and because we know the people and we kind of know their backstory and who they are and who they become, it makes for a really compelling read. Two questions come up to me immediately when talking about your work. First off, I mean, people want to know how is it possible that people are remembering the future? And you talked about remembering forwards and backwards. Can you give us a little primer on why you think that's possible? And then, of course, after that, what is time? I mean, if time, I mean, the people like Donald Hoffman are talking about the death of space and time. I mean, is the block universe part of your theory or what? But so let's start with the first part of that.
yeah, so it goes back. Uh, I guess we should start really with the Enlightenment because there was up until the time of Isaac Newton and those guys, the idea or part of our conception of causation and causality was teleology, which is the idea of causes coming back from the future, causes in the future affecting things in the present. Now, back in the day, teleology inevitably it connoted God. Okay.
Mm.
It
Yeah,
connoted something to do with God's divine plan. Okay.
yeah,
Uh, and as such, in the Enlightenment, when they chucked out God, they decided, okay, you can't be God cannot be part of our explanations of the natural world, which is all well and good. But with that baby, they threw out the bathwater. Or wait a minute, with
yeah.
that bathwater, they threw out the baby of teleology. Okay.
Yeah,
So that worked fine for like 2 centuries. All right, because that was the era of the rise of industrialism, machines that sort of used, that thermodynamic understanding of causation uh, as heat, and heat and the dissipation of heat, that worked well for the creation of machines during the era of industrialism. But at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the idea that unilinear or sometimes what's called efficient causation was sufficient to explain everything in the universe kind of broke down. And this is when electricity and radiation were coming to be understood and theorized and experimented with. And what they found was something really weird, which is at the tiny micro world level of electrons and photons, you can't predict what an individual particle is going to do based on its prior history, which you ought to be able to do if everything is mechanistic at
yeah.
every level. Okay, you should be able to predict what's going to happen in the future from what happened in the past leading up to it. But they discovered that there's this thing that we call uncertainty. Okay, and so this was a huge problem, and it was the basic problem that sort of gave rise to the field of quantum physics, which was it's the study of matter at the very smallest scales. And there's all kinds of weird stuff going on at that scale, as anybody knows who's encountered quantum physics in any form. There's all kinds of weird, spooky stuff,
Yeah.
and there's been no consensus in a century
Yeah.
about
Still.
what it means, but
Yeah.
there's been a dogma.
Hmm.
Now, that dogma is known as the Copenhagen interpretation. And this was formulated by Niels Bohr, and he's a Dane, and so that's why it's called the Copenhagen interpretation. But that dogma is that, well, it's just random. The universe is just random, and you have to deal with it. There's no explanation for it. Randomness is intrinsic to particles, and actually reality only comes into being when you observe, take a measurement and then make a definite, and turn that kind of probability cloud into something real. Okay, that's where we get that commonly expressed notion that observation creates reality and all that. Uh,
Yeah.
there's a lot of sort of branches of the Copenhagen interpretation that sort of build on that idea. You'll hear about the many worlds interpretation, for instance. That's a favorite among
Hugh Everett, right? I mean, the
well,
whole,
yeah, whoever,
yeah,
people who write about these kinds of topics that we're talking about here often favor something like that.
absolutely.
I,
It becomes the catch-all for any kind of spooky thing. It's like you can, yeah. Anyway,
yeah, but there's another interpretation, a much more powerful one that's gaining ground among more and more physicists, which is the idea of retrocausation, and that's just an up-to-date word for teleology. It's the
Mhm.
idea that that seemingly random component in the behavior of a particle, it's
Mhm.
not random at all. It's the determining factor that comes from that particle's future versus the particle's past. So you can know a certain number, you can predict to a certain degree what that particle is going to do, but you can't predict completely, because what determines the rest of that particle's fate is
Yeah.
the next thing that it interacts with in the future.
Okay.
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 Now, this is a mind-blowing concept,
Yeah.
okay? And it's very hard to test, which is why it's kind of, even though it's been floated for decades as a possibility, but it's never really uh, gained traction until the last couple of decades, because it's been impossible to test or design experiments sensitive enough to test this idea. But in the last 2 decades, that has changed, and we have actually now a growing amount of experimental evidence supporting this possibility that a certain amount of the causation in nature, just in our everyday life, is causes issuing back from the future and interacting with causes pushing from the past, and that's there are present, the reality at any given point in time is sort of co-created by the future and the past, which is, that is a huge paradigm shift right there.
Absolutely.
And I think it will be a major paradigm shift, because I think that once that idea gains further ground, it will start to sort of reshape the conversation, not only in physics, but it will then trickle down, and it'll
Yeah.
give people like psychologists, who all take their marching orders from physics, it'll give
Yeah.
them permission to think outside the previous boxes,
Yeah.
and no longer fall back on that idea. Well, it's impossible. Precognition is impossible because you can't have a cause that follows an effect. That will no longer be impossible, and then you'll be able to start talking about this idea. Now, you asked about the block universe. Now, that's very much a part of this.
Okay.
This comes from Einstein. In
Hmm.
his 1905 paper on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, that was the special theory of relativity. Uh, it gave rise to this notion of a space-time continuum, in which time is just a dimension. It's just a dimension along with space. And
Yeah.
that when we think about the physical world, we actually have to think in terms of a four-dimensional space-time block. I forget. It was his teacher Hermann Minkowski who actually came up with this idea that of a space-time continuum. That's the inevitable implication of Einstein's work. I forget who coined the term block universe based on that, but that's kind of a nice way of picturing reality. That
Yeah.
that just okay, get rid of one of the, we can't picture in 4 dimensions. So, okay, sacrifice one of the spatial dimensions and make it a three-dimensional brick, sitting there, and make it a glass brick so you can see inside it. And then every object in that universe, every person, every particle, every planet, whatever, is a world line. Okay, it's actually
Yeah.
a line extending through that block.
Yeah.
And what we experience at any given moment is just a cross section of that world line or that worm or whatever, that extends through the block. Um, so we're experiencing, just a cross section essentially. And
Yeah.
that's what we call a present moment. But that enables that what that means is then that the future, there's already a future. The
Yeah.
future is there, you know,
Existing in some
it
form. Yeah.
exists in a sense, and it can interact with the present. There is a future then that can interact with the present, and there's all kinds of ways that could work. And in time loops, a couple of chapters, I talk about the possible physics and biology that could allow that. There are a number of interesting trends, sort of coming in parallel, and I think that will converge ultimately on a really plausible and testable theory of how precognition actually works in organisms, in living organisms. It's not a fantastical idea anymore at all. And But yeah, it's going to take sort of a larger paradigm shift towards opening towards retro causation, and
Yeah.
then these different fields. So you've got, quantum physics, quantum computing, quantum biology, quantum
Yes.
neuroscience, quantum
Yeah.
neurobiology. They're all going to kind of converge, I think, on a picture of how processes inside neurons are able to
Read
pre-spawn
read that or whatever.
future,
Yeah. Yeah.
future states of those neurons,
Yeah.
which then constrain how neurons connect and make our responses as organisms responsive to future events, uh, whether it happens on a millisecond level, as has been shown in lots of experiments with both people and animals, but happening over longer periods of time and potentially over years and decades, as
Yeah.
as shown very clearly in the dream literature, for instance.
Yeah. Well, and then you get into the questions of generational, things that could possibly draw people forward towards specific fates or determined realities. But then that's the question, right? I mean, like, where is free will in this and determination? Are we just acting out a world line that's already been made, and so the choices we make feel like choices, but we're really just kind of pantomiming? Or do you think that it's like a soft reality for the future and that things are still manipulable?
Well, I think these questions are based on fallacies.
Okay.
And if you dig down, and a million philosophers and physicists have dug into these questions and realized these are false questions, because so you're saying, can we change reality? Well, what do you mean change from what? As we, move, we are part of the causation in the universe. We are part of what makes the future out of our present actions, you
Yeah.
know, even if that future is already there, in a sense, we are part of that.
Yeah.
Um, but what would it mean to change that? Change from what?
Yeah.
We don't know what it is. We can't know the future. That's one thing, precognition does not say that we can know the future.
Yeah.
Uh, it's murky at that very best. So what are you talking about? Changing from what? You know,
Yeah.
uh, there's we're making a future, and that future is there, and it in fact is exerting an influence on us right
Yeah.
now in all kinds of
Yeah.
ways that we're not generally aware of. But it does go by certain names. I mean, intuition is the number one name. If you're an intuitive person and you get gut feelings, and there's just a subtle nudge and you're, like, to do a certain kind of random thing that doesn't make sense, but that pays off. We're talking precognition there. That's a daily life form of precognition. And it
Yeah.
manifests in all kinds of other ways too.
Yeah. Well, your books are very good at plotting examples of this. I mean, one of the stories that I liked the most was the Norman Mailer example and then also Philip K. Dick, and I mean, just a lot of examples of folks who, in your second or your last book, it's like you talk about how these guys write about things and later live it, and there's these odd situations, especially with a mailer living in his apartment complex. But could you sort of review that for us and give a sense of for our viewers?
Yeah, so that was I'm trying to think. I may have the dates wrong here. I think that this was in 1959 or four. I'm not sure if it was 59 or 49. But anyway, he was living in a. He had finished his first novel. Uh, uh, what's his famous war novel? I'm blanking on it. The
The
Naked and
Naked and the Dead? Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And he was working on his second, and he was living in a. He had. Yeah, yeah, he wrote this novel, and he was sort of going with this intuition about this rooming house in Brooklyn, full of all these kind of interesting, kind of eccentric artists characters, and about a writer living, who was writing his next novel in this rooming house. And it turns out that one of the people in this rooming house, one of the artists, is actually a KGB spy, and the plot centered on I think how whether he was going to sort of betray this KGB spy or help narc on him or whatever. I don't remember exactly. It's not a very good novel, honestly. And his intuition, he just intuited this, like, I don't this isn't working, but this is, I have to go with my unconscious here and write this.
Yeah, follow it out.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so yeah, it bombed. The novel got panned by critics and whatever. And while he's kind of like temporarily gave up being a novelist, and he went to the West Coast, Hollywood, did some screenwriting, as a lot of people did at that time. But anyway, a couple of years later, he moves back to New York, and he rents a room in a Brooklyn Heights rooming house, just kind of like in the novel. And this rooming house is kind of full of kind of crazy artist characters. And then one day he sees this New York Times front page headline about this head of this KGB spy ring, like a KGB general who's been living in his rooming house, like directly one floor down from his office where
Mhm.
he was writing his novel. Directly one floor down, turns out to be this KGB master spy who was running a spy ring out of this office. So it's exactly the situation in this novel
Yeah.
he'd written uh, years earlier, about 5 years earlier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was just, dumbfounded, and like, how did that work? Uh,
Yeah. The
but
law of large numbers fails, I think, in that regard.
Well,
You
the thing
know?
is, there's so many of these stories. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can sort of believe the law of large numbers because of the way they're usually presented in ESP books. You'll read books about psychic phenomena or ESP, and you'll get like one or two examples like that. It's like, oh, that's thought-provoking. Oh, and of course, the usual example they give is Morgan Robertson's novel about the Titan hitting an iceberg, and 14 years before the Titanic hits an iceberg. It's like, wow, that's amazing coincidence. But well, if there's just these two examples, that's not much. But you can fill books with examples of this kinds of stuff. And
Yeah.
usually, just like dreams, usually it's not about events in the news or big explosive events in public. It's about upheavals in a person's own life.
Yeah.
Uh,
Meaningful moments. Like,
Meaningful moments,
yeah.
which is another reason why it's hard to study this objectively, because what's meaningful to one person isn't going to be meaningful to another person, and so it's hard to, again, replicate these kinds of things. But the uncanny specificity, I guess, of these literary and artistic prophecies
Yeah.
uh, is just, it's uh, astonishing. And I'd read biographies and memoirs and letters and diaries and stuff of artists my whole life. And so, this was really the topic that interested me most when I finished Time Loops. Was like, I really wanted to delve into the effect, the links between precognition and creativity, and you know, go push beyond the idea that, oh, sometimes artists are prophetic, and say, wait a minute, could there be something intrinsic
Yeah.
to creativity that is prophetic? Could this be an intrinsic aspect of inspiration?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the argument that I push.
Well, and I really appreciate like the connections that you make with like early shamanism as well. Like, I mean, the fact that like this is something that has been with us throughout history and has long been kind of like the a magical thread that certain people have been following and been aware of, and it's been subtly at least helping to shape our species, but we have not recognized it, I guess, scientifically, and maybe that's about to change. We can hope so. The other, so what's interesting also about your theory is that it's not like there's no global, I guess you'd say, precognition necessarily. Like people, when they have a vision of some catastrophe happening, they're not usually precogging or predicting the actual event, but themselves finding out about the event. And you talk a little bit about the book with between Kripal and Elizabeth Crone. And I saw a couple of their interviews, and they were talking about that very thing, that like what she actually ends up predicting or dreaming about is like the photo in the newspaper with Sully or whatever on the wings of the plane and things like that that are very much presented just as the coverage would later come to find out. My question to you is, if I mean, is that cover all of ESP, or I mean, basically like the whole white crow question? If one person has a precognitive moment and predicts something that, like, say they die and don't ever learn the truth of what they've predicted, but it turns out that what they predicted was accurate, would that disprove your theory? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, potentially this. Yeah, and it's something I talk a little bit about in the new book. I There are relatively few cases. Now, again, this is a judgment call, and different artists, or I'm sorry, different writers on this subject will disagree on what constitutes a precognition, or a real precognitive hit. Um, there are very few cases that I'm aware of that where a person has had a vivid, clear precognitive dream, or precognitive anything about an event that followed their death. Um, so it's hard to tell. I mean, if there were a clear-cut case of that, and if there were multiple clear-cut cases of that, I think you'd have to
Sure.
have, you for any kind of to reach any kind of scientific conclusion, and decide that anything is not just a coincidence. You do have to have a a large numerator there.
Yeah.
Uh, as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of people are going to debate me on this, but as far as I'm concerned, there is not a sufficient numerator there to show that. Um, I think that the data, by which I mean not just scientific data, but anecdotal, the mountains of anecdotal data that we have
Yeah.
are pretty consistent, and they point to precognition being very much like memory, with a couple of significant exceptions. In that, like memory, we don't remember, I don't remember the Watergate break-in. You know,
Mhm.
I remember the film All the President's Men, and I have all kinds of images in my head of the Watergate break-in, but I don't remember the event. Likewise, I don't remember 9/11. I don't remember planes crashing in the towers of 9/11, but I do remember the CNN coverage of 9/11. I remember, all kinds of news stories and articles and books that I've read ever since then about that event. So that, what's in our heads about the past all is filtered through our personal experience, and it's mediated, it's mediated by uh, books and news stories and TV shows and the internet and things we've been told by loved ones and friends and so on. So it's all, that's the stuff that becomes memory, and over time, memory becomes very associative and schematic and symbolic, and it gets and it departs greatly from what actually occurred or what actually happened.
Yeah.
Becomes this kind of construct. Well, future memory is going to be the same thing. It's going to be, we are pre-membering uh, learning experiences, personal experiences, direct experiences, but also learning experiences that make an impact on us in one way or another. Uh, and anyone who does precognitive dream work for literally a couple of weeks is going to see this, and you'll find, like, if you engage with the news via social media, predominantly, like I do. I don't watch TV, but I get on Twitter every morning, and unfortunately, but I get, so what I'm seeing, are, you know, images, sometimes graphic images of events, in news stories and like that. That's this kind of stuff that you'll start cropping up in your dreams. You'll start having a dream, but then the moment you get on the internet, it's like, oh my God, I had a dream that was sort of about this, and it may not
Yeah.
be exact, but it's very close. And then you'll, start seeing these patterns of engaging with the media very often. So, I don't know. I've never done the math, but I would say that about half of my precognitive dreams are about things that I encounter generally online or in TV, or if I'm watching a TV show or movie the next day, maybe a scene in a movie or something like that. But there are things in the media that I'm precognizing as much as anything else. So that mediated relationship is there.
It's interesting. I mean, that almost mandates that we become more sensitive to what we're ingesting in terms of our perception, because we're shaping what our,
Mhm.
I mean, well, part of that is what the phenomenon of time loops, like you're talking about. It's like, well, the future is affecting the past, but the past is predicting or affecting the future. So you're always caught in kind of a cycle of,
Mhm.
and what causes what? That's the question that you come down on. And I have a great quote here about that. I guess I'll go ahead and say it now. You talk about time loops and creativity. Quote, creators, and really anyone insofar as we create, are sometimes like God in Genesis, creating literally ex nihilo. The title, From Nowhere, is meant to signal both the out of nowhere quality of precognitive inspiration and the fact that in a world where causal loops could actually be the rule, there really might be no original author of any idea. From nowhere equals from nothing equals from nobody, which is a profound sentence. And I have some personal experience with some of this. I mean, like I used to really write a lot of poetry. And just a brief aside here, when I was a kid, like in my late teens, my cousin had died of a heroin overdose, and she'd had several kids, and it had been a long struggle where she had struggled with her addiction and lost her kids, and I was really kind of upset by it because I felt like, she has kids. Why can't she just snap out of this addiction she has? Like it really kind of angered me and made me really emotional about the whole situation, and I wrote a lot of poems about it. And what's interesting about that is that I later became a heroin addict, and her struggle with the drug really, really affected me in a profound way. Like nothing else of any other kind of family tragedy that had occurred. And I ultimately got clean, and I've been clean for years. But the point of my life that sort of brought me back was the fact that I didn't want to have my kids suffer under the same kind of thing that her kids had suffered under. So I was able to eventually get control of my disease and get clean and come back from that. But to me, like what you're saying, sort of that could play a role here. Like I could have, my future addiction may have been leaking back to sort of affect me with Shelly, my cousin's addiction, and it just gives all kinds of meaning and all these like semantic bridges in life where things are like connected in ways that we never really understood, which is another interesting thing about your theory, where it covers a lot of paranormal or spooky phenomena in our lives that we don't accredit to precognition, but that the what happens seems to be a lot of the things that we're all weirded out by in our daily lives. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Like
Yeah.
synchronicities, for
Well,
instance. And
yeah, exactly right. I mean, all that kind of stuff. It's like, um, yeah,
that's
it's
a
fascinating.
fascinating story you're telling right now. And one of the things that one of the, I guess, hypotheses that I advance in my books is that if there's people ask, well, what's the meaning, or what is this for? What is this doing? I can't say this for certain, but I really feel like the bulk of examples that I've looked at, the bulk of things in my own life that I've looked at, the bulk of other people's experiences point in the direction that there is a sort of singular, most profound signal that that we pick up on and home in on, like almost a homing beacon in our future, that precognitive experiences of all kinds ultimately kind of steer us toward. And that signal is, but I survived. Okay. The idea that uh, of surviving or withstanding challenges. Precognition, you might think that, well, precognition, if it had a functional role, would steer us clear of threats and steer us clear of challenges altogether. But that carries us into that idea of a block universe that, if you're precognizing essentially nothing, I mean, if you're don't have anything to sort of send you a signal of here's a good place to go, there's not going to be a signal there. And the one way we can perceive that we have succeeded is by seeing something bad happening nearby or something bad happening to other people, and it
Mhm.
creates almost a morally ambiguous dimension, I think, to many precognitive experiences, because I think they do feed. I think our precognitive imagination is really most activated when we see like some disaster or some calamity or some close call,
Mhm.
but feel okay, I'm okay, I'm still standing. And like what your example is talking about is like, and it's very unfortunate, it's very tragic, but
Yeah.
but if that was a precognitive signal, it was a signal of your survival
Yeah.
of what happened to, unfortunately, what happened to your sister. Um,
Cousin. But yeah.
right. I mean, it's because yeah, sorry. It's it's that her fate was there in your future, and you were kind of, I would interpret it as you were
Sure.
responding to your own kind of proximity almost, or
Yeah.
there the grace of God go I is another phrase that often comes to my mind when I think about the kinds of situations that precognition, oddly enough, carries us toward, you know, which seems weird, but I think that, if this makes any kind of evolutionary sense, which I think it has to, that is logical. It's like you're not
Yeah.
going to get that "but I survived" signal if there's no threats or nothing bad happening anywhere,
Yeah.
uh, anybody
It's like
else.
adversity creates meaning, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and that's what,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. So, I mean, like in terms of our culture and whatnot, how do you think that this can will ultimately shape how we live our lives? What are the ramifications socially of this awareness if it ultimately gets borne out by the science? How do you think it'll impact the way that we chart our lives?
That's a great that's a great question. I like to think that it certainly for me and for I know other people I've worked with who do this work and who become aware and awakened to their precognition, it adds this intense value to one's own life, but also the lives of others, because you start to see that, I'm not just this assemblage of atoms here right now talking to you, but not only do I have a real past that's really solid, it's still there in a sense, but I have a future too. And you start to see yourself as what I call a long self. And
Yeah.
that long self, uh, it's kind of a gnosis to become awakened to that long self. And these
Yeah.
precognitive experiences, if you start having them on a regular basis, it's one thing to have one like precognitive dream that just kind of like, whoa, blows your mind, but then it sort of fades from memory and you don't necessarily even believe it anymore. But then you start having these experiences all the time. It really reinforces that sense of the long self, which I think uh, it makes, I think that can't help but make you a wiser and better person. And it gives you, it sort of adds to your appreciation of life in general and human life. And I can imagine extending that view, to, the environment and to the planet and so on, having that sense of an already existing future that we should, you know, we want that future. It's paradoxical because you have a
Sure.
sense of a future that, it already exists, but it inspires you then to act to create a future that you want
Yeah.
in a sort of time loop way. Oddly enough, I come back a lot to Calvinism. If there's any kind of theological worldview that everybody hates,
Yeah,
universally,
absolutely.
no
Yeah,
one
yeah,
wants to
yeah.
be a Dutch Calvinist, of all things, with predestination and all that. But,
Yeah.
I've realized that, wait a second, there's a way in which Calvin was right. When you have a sense of a future and a that's already written in a sense, it weirdly kind of activates or entrains you to be better and to do better,
Yeah.
it kind of elevates you.
Yeah.
And so this is what I tried, like when people always throw the free will thing at me. And it's
Yeah,
like,
because I mean it's like you
what
still
about
have the
free will? Free
choices.
will,
Yeah.
there's people are so clingy to their free will. It's like, and I just, I'd say just set aside the free will thing and just, you know, uh, break outside of that need, examine that need, first of all. What is that need you have for free will? And then uh, just sit with these ideas and have some experiences like this and, get back to me and
Yeah.
see if
Well,
we really are.
there's no sense that we're losing choice. You know what I mean? It's like we're still living our lives in the present moment. And the will is still our own, but it's as if living in the block universe, what the choices that we are going to make have already been made in some sense. And we're in a process of discovery. Like, we're conscious blips floating through the world line or whatever you want to say. And it's like, it's still a process of creation because our awareness is prior, and so we can relax about the free will thing. It's still there.
Right. Become a spectator. I mean, that's a very basic kind of Eastern
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, yeah,
And as a Zen practitioner, that's it. It meshes perfectly well with this. Like our best, uh, when we are at our best, is when we are setting aside all thoughts of will and choice and all that stuff, and just becoming a kind of a part of a larger process or machine or whatever, when we're in a flow state,
yeah,
doing whatever it is you'd love to do and do best,
yeah.
whether that be art or, sports or piloting a jet fighter or
Mhm.
whatever,
Yeah,
when you are in that zone, you are your best self.
yeah,
And you are not thinking about free will, you know,
yeah,
and that's, I think, a state to aspire to. And that's the thing that Zen people were always emphasized, that state. And Zen Satori experiences often are in some way or another about kind of the permanence of the universe rather than
yeah,
kind of being open to human intervention. It's becoming a spectator is kind of the key, I think.
yeah. It's an interesting message that goes along with recovery a lot of the time. People
Yes.
who are trying to control and shape the future when they're taught to kind of live more healthy lives, it's like let go and let God or whatever your higher power is, and not struggle against, whatever life. So that's fascinating. One of the interesting implications of your work also, which I thought was really fascinating, is that it's my word of the day, I guess, fascinating. Your notion that what's the word? When creators are creating and they have resonances with other people's work, it's not necessarily plagiarism. It may be future remembering the works of that inspire you. And like, how do we adjudicate that in court? Like, where do we go with that kind of stuff? I mean, ultimately, yeah,
Well, that's the thing, like free will,
yeah,
uh, you kind of need this fiction for legal to live in a society, you need the fiction of kind of autonomy and responsibility, and you need these fictions, and there's no way around that. Uh, but yeah, I do think that what gets called plagiarism is often a kind of, or could often be a kind of precognitive anticipation of artworks and
Yeah.
things that we're about to encounter and that will inspire us. So yeah, this the third part of my From Nowhere is sort of centered on this, and I think that it goes beyond the question of plagiarism. It's really a mechanism for thinking about what I call I'm as a former anthropologist, I used technical terms, but what I call retrograde cultural transmission. Culture is usually seen as this vehicle for carrying ideas and life ways and so on forward into the future, and parents instruct their children and teachers instruct their students and blah 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 blah. But I think that the reality of precognition as a factor in human culture and as a factor in creativity inevitably opens up a door for information to pass backwards from the future to the past, and for
Yeah.
the same sense of like threading our individual lives past like fatal dangers. I think there's a sense in which this may work on a societal level to steer a culture, steer a civilization, you know, towards the vicinity of something really bad, but towards survival, ultimate survival. And I think that I sort of propose that what people often call archetypes, the kind of the Jungian
Yeah.
sense of these sort of core symbols. What if they are kind of the way this kind of information from the future is manifesting and being passed back through the generations of
Yeah.
artists and visionaries and initiates and initiatory traditions, religious traditions, and so on. It's an idea.
Yeah.
I like this way of I like to flip both Freud and Jung in my writing, and this is one way in which I think flipping Jung makes this idea of archetypes and the collective unconscious a lot more interesting
Yeah.
and really plausible to me. That there's that what we call archetypes are often really these images that are really coming backwards from the future and that
Yeah.
reflect where we're going. Um,
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying with the explanatory power of the theory. With like, it covers a lot of metaphysical ground and a lot of intuitions that we've had about like the higher self, for example. Like mystics often talk about layers of the soul and a higher self that is kind of a guiding presence. Could that just be like ripples coming back from your future life, kind of helping to guide you now? And we're all picking up signals in various ways, but it all could be a form of that cognition,
yeah,
which,
that's what I argue.
yeah,
Yeah, what
yeah,
gets called the higher self is really our long self. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I love it. That's fascinating. So, a question I had for you is that how has your work been received by folks, your peers? I mean, in terms of um, have you had any sort of violent reactions from folks who you respect in terms of the sciences who are like, this can't be true? Or are you opening people's minds, do you think, in the establishment?
And frustratingly, I think I'm stuck in the kind of paranormal uh, world of people who take UFOs and psychic phenomena seriously, but it has not really penetrated outside that bubble yet. I would like it to, but it's very hard. It's very hard challenging mainstream thinking about things. You find that there's a real resistance. There's like a force field around these topics. Uh, and that's why I'm kind of waiting. I'm biding my time, I guess. I'm really hoping that paradigm shift in physics is what I'm really watching, because every academic field takes its marching orders, not marching orders, but its kind of it takes its lead from physics, and physics starts talking in a new way about causation.
Yeah.
That will be the permission then for other scientists in other fields to start talking about things like precognition or responsiveness or whatever. And then if academics are talking about it, that will then disseminate into the wider culture and give permission to talk about this stuff outside of the realm of, religious belief or new age, you know, philosophy that doesn't really, connect with reality, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of has to happen. So no, I have not gotten the most pushback I've gotten is from parapsychologists. Uh,
Interesting. Yeah, like the pushing it both sides. There you go. I mean, they
well,
have
I've
their
been
own
called
dogma, right?
Well, there is unfortunately a kind of dogma that has formed, and this is just really in the last, I would say, decade or two, around this idea that it's all centered on consciousness. Consciousness, it's all about consciousness. And my time loops, a very prominent parapsychologist who I admire their work, they disliked my book because they called it promissory materialism, which is an epithet that I think Rupert Sheldrake originally, he's not the one that said that, but I mean, I
Mm.
think he's used that against, materialists and people who want to uh, want to use standard materialistic terms to talk about these phenomena. Uh, but
Promissory. What does he mean by that? I wonder. I
He
mean,
means he means this idea that well, we can't explain it now, but just give us time, and using the
I see.
materialism, we'll be able to explain it. But
Yeah, like an apologist for materialism or whatever. I mean,
right,
yeah,
right. But
yeah,
the thing is, well, just to take, this is the counter argument I offer for Rupert Sheldrake's ideas of
yeah,
morphic resonance and so on, or that is equally promissory. I mean, it's he doesn't have a mechanism either for talking about
yeah,
it. He's looking to some new vocabulary with it comes from, I don't know what, that's going to somehow make sense of that. But he can't do it either. So it's always going to be promissory in one way or
yeah,
another until we have a real uh, mechanism. But I think it's the idea that materialism is dead is false, because people think that materialism is uh, like a total view of reality or something. Materialism is just the vocabulary, the very high precision vocabulary for talking about things in the natural world that are measurable, and that are amenable to scientific study and to manipulation, technological manipulation. That's what materialism is. And since the Enlightenment, we've really had a kind of divergence of the language for talking about the material world and the language for talking about everything else and talking about human experience. And that divergence is because as science and technology have become more and more powerful, the terms we use for talking about the natural world have become more and more fine-grained and precise. It's like a very high resolution picture versus a kind of low resolution picture. And it's very hard to mesh those. You can sort of map one onto the other, but then to ordinary people, it feels like when you're explaining some mental phenomenon, using the language of synapses and neurotransmitters and stuff like that, then it feels like you're being reductive and you've reduced it. It's only that. Well, we're talking about the same reality. If we're not, I assume most of us would not really subscribe to Cartesian dualism, right? That there's somehow two realities. I mean, I think that there's one, I'm a monist, like I think most people implicitly are. We think there's a single reality. And so
yeah,
all we're debating about is the language we use to describe that reality,
yeah.
right? And so we're
Hmm.
we're really talking about two or more different vocabularies. And so the idea that, oh, this vocabulary is dead, well, good luck building an iPhone or building
Yeah,
a
I mean,
rocket or designing a new drug to treat, Alzheimer's or whatever. Good luck doing any of those things without that high precision language of materialism. You need, that's always going to be there, and it's all hopefully, and it's always
yeah,
going to more and more high precision as we gain more and more control over the natural world, which I think is it's a good thing. We need that control. We don't want to retreat to some kind of medieval world where we all died at age 30 from some, you know, uh, easily preventable disease. Um, so, that's what these debates are about.
Yeah,
Let me just add that my other beef with the idiom of consciousness is
yeah.
that uh, these phenomena that I'm studying, precognition in particular, actually have very little to do with consciousness in the vernacular sense of the term of being awake and aware.
Hmm.
You know, they are all uh, phenomena of what Freud called the unconscious. Now, I know people will just conflate those and say it's all the same thing, but no, I think it's really important to retain that distinction because one of the really key things about precognition is the way it really evades our kind of sense of our conscious will and our ego.
Yeah,
And there are really interesting reasons for this that I go into in my books. But they manifest precisely in these unconscious ways through dreams, through symptoms of various kinds, through obsessions, through synchronicities, through just a thought pops into your head from nowhere, to take the title of my book, and
yeah,
then you suddenly get or suddenly see that thing on TV or whatever. uh, it's these unconscious modalities that are super important for understanding precognition and I think a lot of other kind of related phenomena. And so
yeah,
when you say, oh, it's all about consciousness, and like, well, higher consciousness somehow will be more precognitive. That's not true at all. I mean, the less conscious you are, the more precognitive you are. So
yeah,
I think for a lot of reasons, you know, consciousness is the wrong way to go. There's no agreement about what consciousness is.
yeah.
It's just kind of become a flag for people who don't like materialism, but that's a misguided uh, animosity, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. When I was talking with Dean Radin, he made that point to the fact where like to say that we materialism is dead or dying or that's a misnomer, and it's always going to be a part of whatever answers we ultimately arrive at, and that we need to be careful of the language we use when we're trying to deconstruct the paradigm that may be limiting us in certain respects. And I think that he probably has um, sort of that consciousness angle in some respects. But in that particular moment, he was talking about making sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of materialism, which is interesting. But you mentioned that your parents were scientific psychologists. To ask a personal question, are they aware of your work, and what's their response?
My father died, unfortunately, before I embarked on this path. I don't think he I don't think he would have been like, in agreement. I think he would have been very like fiercely
Yeah.
fiercely opposed. There's kind of a stereotype in psychobiography that creative people sort of come alive when their fathers die, and I think
Yeah.
that was certainly true with me. I'd
Me too. Me too.
it was only after I lost my father, and which unfortunately it saddens me greatly, and I'm not happy about it, but it took away, I think, a big barrier, I think, to going in directions that I have gone in that I'm sure he would not have approved of. My mother also is, she's very rationalistic and scientific in her thinking. She knows my work, and I don't think she really cares one way or another. She's just happy that I'm publishing books. I don't
Yeah,
think
and
she.
doing well, I'm sure. Yeah, it seems like intellectually kind of a lonely place to be. I mean, like, how do you handle that if you are pushing boundaries, but you're not pushing boundaries in the way that a lot of people would prefer? I mean, it's the right place to be, judging by history and everything else, because it's the people who are the renegades who are asserting, a truth that isn't just out to satisfy interest groups, is where the answers generally lie. But how does that feel?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's been my intuition all my life, and so I remind myself of that. Yeah,
Mhm.
because yeah, it is lonely and it's frustrating. And especially when one writes one's first book, one has, fantasies that you're going to change the world and that people are going to like, awaken to this, amazing thing that you have to say. And when you like see that crickets, crickets, you just don't get, you get one or two, get on a couple podcasts, and then it's like, and my I had some very I won't say traumatic, but very, very powerfully disappointing moments, early in my writing career when I realized, okay, I'm not going to change the world with this, but it's time loops has become sort of a sleeper, and it's like I have a lot of fans, and
Yes, you do.
I around the
Highly
world,
considered.
I have fans. I found out a couple of years ago that Alan Moore is a fan of time loops and is like, wow, that's that's pretty cool. And so like I do have a small I do have a following, and I know that I'm touching people's lives in maybe not as many as would be ideal, but I think that's the most important thing, is just to yeah, stay true to your personal vision. I think to me the most interesting, I don't know, writers and thinkers are always the people who aren't like writing for a big audience, but are just staying true to what they have to say. And if fate ends up that they you know gain greater recognition, that's great, but that's not what it's about. So
And ultimately, like in fields like this, time will bear out or not the truth of everything. And someone maybe like in 20 years be like, well, this book had it predicted, so many years ago, and then all of a sudden you're famous and all the things that we want now.
I don't think fame is I don't think that's in my,
Well, I mean,
but
yeah.
yeah. And
Well, I
I hasten to add, I'm not the first person who's made these arguments. And that's actually one of the interesting and kind of frustrating things, is the more I've done this work, I feel like I'm kind of being a little bit of a path breaker in a certain way, but then I keep discovering that in the past people have made, very close to the same argument or similar arguments, at least about the precognition part. Um, and there have been, and mostly they're self-published books, or books from very small presses that have gotten completely forgotten. But I've got a growing library of people who've made very similar arguments for decades. Uh, that it's tough changing people's minds or awakening people,
yeah.
because just the prevailing winds of culture kind of are just blowing against you. And yeah.
They're bedded down and covered up. Well, that's all I got for you, Eric. I appreciate your time and your fantastic conversation. I love your books, and thank you for taking the time to meet with us and talk about it.
Yeah, well, this was really fun, and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no, man.